what I want to talk about first is what I call the nuclear industrial complex. I want to begin by reminding you that uranium, which is one of the main raw ingredients of nuclear weapons, has to be mined. And when it's mined, it leaves tailings. One of the biggest uranium mines in the world is in Canada, near Estevan. Its tailings cover several square miles, and they make that part of the world uninhabitable. Almost every country has one or more uranium mines. They're always looking for them, and the less the less concentrated the uranium metal is, the larger the tailings field. So uranium mining is the first environmental consequence of the nuclear industrial complex. The second thing that happened was the development of nuclear weapons. We're going to be celebrating, we're not celebrating, but memorializing the bombing of Nagasaki this afternoon. That bombing killed 80,000 people immediately and many thousand more later. The Hiroshima one killed 80,000. Nagasaki killed 40,000 immediately and many thousand more later. And we devastated a wide area and made it uninhabitable for some time. Now, we have the fact that there are still many nuclear weapons in the world. I have a little chart here. I don't know if you can see it, but I'll take it off and show it to the rest of you. The countries in orange are those with nuclear weapons. The U.S. and Russia have the most. The U.S. has over 8,000. About half of them are on high alert, ready to go in a few minutes. Russia has 10,000. About 5,000 of those are on high alert. The other main countries are the United Kingdom and France. And some of these countries have signed treaties. The U.S. has not ratified its treaty against nuclear proliferation. But anyway, more recently we have China, which now has several hundred nuclear weapons, and Israel, of course, which keeps secret the number it has. It's estimated to be between 80 and 200. And then we have Pakistan and India with nuclear weapons. All these countries have enough nuclear weapons to destroy a good part of the world's environment. It's said that the U.S. nuclear weapons, the ones on high alert, are capable of destroying every city in Russia 70 times over. The world would become uninhabitable if a nuclear war ever happened. It would become uninhabitable not only on account of the nuclear fallout. I'm not going to go into the details of that, but you know that many of the nuclear weapons produce a whole series of radioactive substances, some of which have half-lives of thousands of years. And beyond that, there would be a nuclear winter because of the amount of material in the air which would prevent sunlight from reaching Earth. So a nuclear war would essentially destroy the planet. Because that's pretty much what I call environmental destruction. Okay, so that's the problem of nuclear weapons. The history of treaties trying to control nuclear weapons is complex, and I haven't time to go into it. Let's just say that in the U.S., it's very difficult to get any treaty that's signed through the Senate. So a lot of treaties that have been signed have not ever been ratified. In any case, the whole problem of nuclear weapons is one that the Victoria Grannies have always been focused on. Their first role here was trying to keep nuclear submarines out of our harbor, and they succeeded in that. But the world has so far not succeeded in keeping in getting rid of nuclear weapons. There are initiatives, and they need to be supported. In the last part of the talk, I'm going to tell you about some of the anti-nuclear organizations that you might be associated with or get associated with. Now, the next part of the nuclear industrial complex are the nuclear plants. I consider them potential weapons of mass destruction. This is a little slightly hopeful chart. I hope you can get an idea. The bars in green are the newly constructed and open plants. The bars in yellow are the ones that are closed down. You will see that in the beginning and right up until the mid-1980s, they were mostly constructed, the plants. Now, as we go into the 2000s, more and more of these plants are being closed and fewer are being opened. That, however, is not a guarantee of safety, because there are still plans and groups who push for the construction of nuclear plants, especially in the U.S. and to some degree in Canada. And I call nuclear plants weapons of potential mass destruction because we know already about the history. We know about Chernobyl, a plant which was destroyed by poor design and poor control by the people who ran it. The nuclear industry claims that only 31 people were killed in that explosion. There are, however, strong evidence that thousands were damaged and that thousands of premature deaths have and will result from the nuclear explosion and the genetic effects. Then we have Fukushima, which again a case of bad design and poor in handling of the situation, where the claim is that only 2 or 3 people died, but over 6 people have got lethal doses of radiation, and many others have very high levels of radiation, and the problem is still unsolved. The nuclear rods are still sitting in the plants where the explosion occurred. They're trying to remove them. They're having a lot of trouble, and the problem is not going to go away. So until we get rid of nuclear plants altogether, there's always the potential of nuclear mass destruction. So that's the second aspect. Canada has nuclear plants. The U.S. has nuclear plants. All of us need to do something about it. In Canada, we should be fighting to prevent the refurbishment and extension of the licenses of nuclear plants, particularly in Ontario. Anyway, so I want to now turn to one other aspect of the nuclear industrial industry. That is depleted uranium. You probably know that uranium, when it's mined, has a very high content of uranium-238 and very low content, less than 1%, of uranium-235. 235 is the one which is capable of fission when an adequate mass is produced. So nuclear weapons involve the enhancement of the content of U-235. Now, depleted uranium is uranium which is produced after you've removed and concentrated the 235. So it has even less 235 than the original mined uranium. Nevertheless, it is a very dangerous material, and it's been widely spread. Let me admit that there is controversy. When I was teaching at the university, at McMaster University, I was associated with a group called Physicians for Global Survival, and they're a very important peace activist and anti-nuclear activist was a physicist, Alan Phillips, and some of you may have heard of Alan, and he claimed that depleted uranium was safe. That was because depleted uranium produces mainly alpha particle radiation. Alpha particles are large, they don't penetrate deeply, they don't penetrate a few layers of clothing. So he said, it's not a problem. It is a problem, and it's a problem for several reasons. First, depleted uranium used in weapons causes the spread over wide areas of the dust when these weapons hit something and are exploded. The dust persists. People inhale it, they ingest it, and uranium is not only radioactive, it's also toxic. Now, uranium-238 has a very long half-life, so Phillips would claim that it's so long half-life, which means that it doesn't produce a lot of radiation, that it's not dangerous. The problem is that once it gets into your body, it can stay there and it can produce radiation at a given location, often in the lungs or in the GI tract, for long periods of time. But even more important is that uranium is chemically toxic. It is a chemical which can be damaging to almost every organ system in the body. And we now know that finally it's been accepted that the Gulf War veterans in the U.S. who were poisoned by depleted uranium. And attempts are being made, and we should be part of it, to prevent further use of depleted uranium for any purpose, especially for weapons where they will be exploded and cause the spread of dust all over the environment. My final brief comment is about drones. You say, well, what have drones got to do with the environment? First of all, let me tell you that I call the U.S. regime, I call it the Obama regime, because he believes that he has the right, as using executive power, to kill any citizen of the U.S. or anybody anywhere, irrespective of proof of any of their crimes. In any case, drones were first introduced in large measure by Israel, and they were used particularly over Gaza, and they're there buzzing around Gaza all the time. They can stay there for hours, and then they can target somebody, and they are used to kill. And they're also used for surveillance. And now drones are being introduced into the United States in large numbers, and police forces are planning to use them. Initially, they say only for surveillance. So what I'm saying to you is that the environment of the culture of peace can be seriously destroyed by a culture of drones controlled thousands of miles away or hundreds of miles away by some youngster sitting at a console ready to either observe what you're doing, or if the government, the Obama regime, doesn't like what you're doing, it can blow you up. So I think that drones have a major impact on the environment of peace. They can destroy it, make it almost impossible to function in a peaceful world. So that's my comment.
I just want to follow on very quickly to this, what Ed has said about the destroying powers. And now we're going to look at what's being destroyed. First of all, of course, it's human beings, us. And we think of us first because we are us. It's also all of the plant and animal kingdom, all up and down the scale. The thing that bothered me most in the research of this was to find out that there is a glaring failure of environmental regulation of bodies to enforce what small amount of legislation there is. It's not being enforced. However, there is some regulation there. And in the last half of our being here together, we're going to look at how can we do that enforcement? How can we make that happen? I went to ceasefire. In researching this, it was just heartbreaking. And so many facts all over the place. And so I went to ceasefire. I'm going to read you quickly some of this because this says it beautifully. The activities of the world's militaries are the greatest contributors to greenhouse gases and to climate change, both in times of war and peace. During times of war, great expanses of natural foliage and forestry are devastated, along with agricultural land, Wildlife and endangered species are put under serious threat. Weapons comprised of toxic substances are emitted into our air and water and distributed on our land upon impact or detonation. Shells, vehicles, and weapons are abandoned in war zones and are left to degrade and contaminate surrounding areas. And then he says, he's giving me a synopsis, which I'm going to really stick to because he covers the whole gamut. This is the he here, I don't have his name. He's just one of the many researchers at Ceasefire and Polaris. International militaries' emissions are shielded from national reporting requirements. They're not willing to subject their armed forces to the levels of transparency and accountability that are required of other government and civil societies, as they are not considered a part of industry. And this silence is protected under U.S. and national law and the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. In other words, the whole military establishment and the whole thing that happens with military action is never reported. It's never counted in the amount of CO2 that comes out of this country or that country. And war accelerates fuel use. In other words, when you take something from here, let's say you're going to take an army to Israel or weapons to wherever, it takes a lot of fuel to get them there. And then when they're there, they do their damage and they use their fuel. And think how often fighter planes are taking off and what amount of CO2 is put into the air there. One estimate, the U.S. Army used 1.2 million barrels of oil in Iraq in just 1 month in 2008. And the highest rate of fuel use has to do in part with the fact that fuel must be delivered to vehicles in the field by other vehicles using fuel. And military vehicles used in both Iraq and Afghanistan produced many hundreds of thousands of tons of carbon monoxide, nitrogen oxides, hydrocarbons, and sulfur dioxide, in addition to CO2. Sulfur dioxide, SO2, is lethal. There's strict requirements as to how much is allowed to be in the air that we breathe. Every city has their limits on that. Ecocide is a deliberate strategy. The total forest area decreased 38% in Afghanistan from 1990 to 2007, resulting in, because of illegal logging, which is associated with the rising power of the warlords who have been enjoying U.S. support. In addition, deforestation has occurred in each of these countries as refugees seek out fuel and building materials. Drought, desertification, and species loss that accompany habitat loss have been the result. Military actions accelerates wildlife destruction. Bombing in Afghanistan and deforestation have threatened an important migratory thoroughfare for birds leading through this area. The number of birds now flying this route has dropped by 85%. U.S. bases become a lucrative market for the skins of endangered snow leopard, that beautiful animal. And impoverished and refugee Afghans have been more than willing to break the ban on hunting the snow leopards. In place since 2002, foreign aid workers who arrived in the city in large numbers following the collapse of the Taliban regime have also purchased the skins. The remaining numbers in Afghanistan were estimated between 100 and 200 in 2008. Now that means there's such a limited gene pool of these snow leopards that it's a species that's going to be extinct, and the price goes up. And the price goes up, you're right. Toxic dust, Ed has talked about that. Since 2001, there has been 251% rise in the total neurological disorders, a 47% increase in the rate of respiratory problems, 34% rise in the rates of cardiovascular disease in military service members that is now likely related to the problem of toxic dust. And that has not been mentioned, but I researched the depleted uranium for when NATO was meeting here. And depleted uranium has undoubtedly caused many, many extremely distorted human beings to be born. I looked at the pictures and made posters, and my fellow activists refused to carry the posters. It was just heartbreaking. And these are being born to the families of the soldiers who have been serving in that area.
And to the people in
And
Afghanistan.
people, yes, that was my next thing. Thank you.
Sorry.
Don't do that, I need it. The people in the next, people in those countries. And the people in those countries, there's no hospitals to go to, no support system, and I imagine the children are simply buried when they're born so distorted, because they have no support system. So, very depressing for early in the morning.
Yeah, really.
And this is reality. This is reality. The funding of wars detracts from funding of green initiatives. Now, this is going to be one of our main problems in trying to get action. We're going to have to figure ways to do it without a lot of money. There's no big handouts anymore. Money is no longer available for other things such as clean energy and funding for communities vulnerable to climate impacts around the world. And here are some figures. The projected total cost of the Iraq War was at least $3 trillion. Total Obama administration defense budget request is for $687 billion. Additional amount estimated for Obama's Afghan surge, $40 billion. The total $3.73 trillion approximately. These figures are so hard to comprehend. International Climate Change Fund gets $1.4 billion. And there we have it. So, what was it you wanted to do?
I wanted to show you this book by Cecil Pineda, Devil's Tango, that is the same theme that, I forgot your name, I forget. Ed. All names. And she writes about Fukushima. Fukushima is kind of the central theme, but she goes out to all sides, especially what happens in the United States. Power plants, she also talks about these horrible things with the depleted uranium. Why is it called depleted? To make us think it's harmless?
Because
It's just a spin, baby.
Yeah.
Can you tell us the title again, please?
The title is Cecil Pineda, Devil's Tango.
Why is the depleted uranium put in future weapons? Like, why do they use it?
To get
The
rid of it.
depleted uranium is used in weapons, and particularly in shells, ammunition, because it's a very heavy, dense material, and therefore it can cause greater penetration, greater damage. That's the reason.
They can pierce a tank easily.
In the attack in Kuwait, they remember there were a lot of Iraqi tanks spread all over the part of Kuwait near Iraq, and the U.S. destroyed with depleted uranium weapons thousands of those tanks, and every time a tank was hit by a depleted uranium projectile, it spread the depleted uranium for hundreds of meters. And now, because of the winds that flow in that region and the fact that it's very dry, it got spread all over that region. And Fran pointed out, in some places like Basra in southern Iraq, there was a very high concentration, and that's where the very high number of reproductive problems. But what one can say about nuclear energy as an alternate possibility is that you're really creating a problem for yourself. But I didn't mention one very important matter: what you do with nuclear waste. That has never been solved. So you want to produce more of it?
The petrochemical industry is rogue. It's calling the shots of every government, and we are the ones that are suffering. Yeah. Yes.
I was just going to draw a connection for us to be aware of, that our addiction to oil fuels our addiction to war, and vice versa, the addiction to war and, you know, extending our power fuels the addiction to oil, because historically, armies move on oil. That's you know, been true for decades.
Don't have before
And
that.
strategically for us to speak to the public, I'm, you know, trying to think how you piggyback on all the advertising and hype that goes into fighting breast cancer and the March of Dimes. What we need is, you know, a worldwide concern about breast cancer and draw, you know, make that link apparent if we can.
Yes,
And also, we need a March of Dimes in Iraq and Afghanistan.
yes, we do. So every time we are assaulted in some way or other with advertisement or pleas for money to breast cancer, and these people that are asking for the money do not make the connection, we must make that connection. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Judy is next.
When I approach congressmen, legislators, I've been using the approach that the nuclear power plants are a real target for terrorists, because that's the big
That's their concern these days, yeah.
And so, you know, how are you going to protect these? There's only 5 watchmen in a nuclear power plant. There's no protection from airplanes. So we really can't have these, you know, target sites right next to Los Angeles.
Okay, what I wanted to say is I think that one of the things as Raging Grannies that we should really actively work towards is pulling together the environmental groups with the people that are anti-war, with the people that are trying to stop voter suppression. Well, all of this is our environment. And I think what happens is, you know,
How would we do it?
how we would do it would be,
This is what we're
maybe
here
it's
for.
time, and I've not done this myself, but maybe it's time for us to join the Sierra clubs, to join the environmental groups as well. And we all say, well, because it's difficult with time, but as I keep hearing more and more, and it clicks with me, is that, you know, you can send as many emails as you want and all these kinds of things, that they are not working. They're not working because you don't even have to open them. You just see an email, you can go delete, delete, delete. And I think that's probably what happens with a lot of the emails that we send to our representatives. So in order to have people power, because people power is the only thing that is going to do it. That because the media will not cover you, but if you have thousands and thousands of people, and I don't just mean, I mean in Madison, Wisconsin, when we had 150,000 people on the square, media covered us. Okay? There, it comes to a point where they have to, even though they're very corporate. By trying to, you know, during the Vietnam War, what we did in SDS was we built coalitions. We built them with the churches. We built them with every group that we could talk to. And I think it's time to go back to that.